the black box that you don't know, try to figure them out better, is really a key to really developing, I think, a strong biosecurity in a regional or area that will minimize the risk of disease introduction.
Welcome to Swineherd Canada. My name is John Patience, your host for today's broadcast. And with us today, we have Dr. Luc Dufresne, who recently joined Swine Veterinary Partners, a group of 4 veterinary clinics that focus on swine herd health located across Canada. And so we're delighted to have Luc with us today to talk about biosecurity. So welcome, Luc. How are you today?
I'm very good, John. Thank you.
Great. Before we get started and talking about the topic that I think is you're kind of near and dear to your heart, maybe you could give the audience a bit of your background on, sort of where you got started and how you ended up in the position that you're at today, talking about biosecurity.
Okay. Well, I'm born and raised in Quebec, Canada. I'm a concrete veterinarian. My dad was a furrier, actually, so not exposed to pig farming at all. Then I went to vet school in St. Hyacinthe in Montreal, graduated in '88. In the last year of vet school, I was thinking dairy farming, but I went to Davis for an internship and started dealing with big population medicine there, and I fall in love with large population epidemiology. That's why it kind of drive me to go work in the swine industry. So because the at the time the dairy farm in Quebec were about 30 to 50 dairy farms, so it was a different type of medicine at this time. So I basically worked for a company called Suregain in Quebec, which was feed company, but also had some integration of swine there for 9 years. Then moved to the States and went to work for Browns of Carolina, which was the initial production system of Smithfield Food. Was there for 4 years. Then with the PIC for 2 years, and I joined Seaboard as director of their veterinary service in 2004 and was there until 2023. And then shortly now I joined the Swine Vet Partner in Canada, which I'm pretty excited to come back. A lot of change now, right? To get back, we've not been in Canada for 25 years now, so it's quite a bit of change coming up right now.
I'm sure lots of adjustment going on in your life.
Swine Veterinary Partners offers a full range of animal health and production services to Canadian pork producers. We approach health management through personalized solution with concern for profitability while taking into account performance and the well-being of your animals.
And I'm intrigued, and maybe if you could spend just a few minutes talking a little bit about the Swine Veterinarian Partners, because I'm intrigued by that, the multi-clinic collaboration or working together in a coordinated way. So if you could tell us a little bit about that, I think it's an interesting model.
Yeah, it's basically 4 clinic. It's Demeter, Quebec, Demeter, Ontario, Premier, SHP in Manitoba, and Precision veterinary services in Alberta. And all of those clinic have basically kind of joined force to share technical knowledge and expertise and work together. So I've basically joined that group of clinic and work with we start working with all of them pretty soon, and most on an area of second line diagnostic and second line vet work, and also try to lead and mentor the younger veterinary group, and also help on the research and development aspect of it.
Right on, you bet. And I have a question it's an unexpected one, Luc, but I'm curious about that, and I'm curious about this model, and oftentimes we'll see in Canada at least that the veterinarians within a clinic will have all graduated, maybe not all from the same veterinary school, but most from similar veterinary school, because Canada's kind of geographically laid out when it comes to veterinary training. But with SVP, you now have the opportunity to bring together veterinarians that have been trained maybe in Saskatoon or maybe in Guelph or Saint-Hyacinthe or maybe even PI, I don't know.
and even a veterinarian from other country too.
Right. So is there a difference? Like, does that bring something different to SVP? Like, is there a difference in philosophical training amongst the veterinary schools that when you bring people together from those different schools, it creates, you might call hybrid vigor, that if we were geneticists, or is it pretty much similar? The training's pretty similar.
I think it's a combination. Your schooling is an important part of it, but your experience with the type of customer that you're dealing with, either if it's working with colonies or working with integration producer or working with genetic company, all of those have different objective or how they operate. So you have that combination of that personal experience, but also the type of customer you were dealing with and the type of production they have that bring the wealth of experience. So it's a very
Okay. Yeah.
different type and very group that has a lot of different experience, and that bring, I think, a lot of synergy and a lot of increase brain power that is interesting. So for me, what I bring for the last 25 years is not a high health experience. I deal with a lot of disease for a
Yeah.
lot of
Right.
time, so it's going to be a nice change to work in Canada in system that have much higher health than what I've dealt with in for a while.
Right. Great. And sort of kind of get off on a tangent there, but as you were talking, I thought, gee, I wonder how that works with, but your point's well taken. And I can see that it's not only the training, but it's also the post-training experience that you get working with different, not only different clients, but different kinds of clients who have different objectives and view swine medicine in different ways. So thanks for that. But I'll bring us back on topic here. Sorry, but we're going to talk about biosecurity today. And Luc, you said you wanted to talk about biosecurity more in a global context. So maybe if you could introduce first the subject of biosecurity and what you mean by taking a global approach and why you think it's so important.
Okay. Basically, when you talk about biosecurity, is basically the basic set of rules you try to put in place to overall protect the farm against the introduction of new pathogen. And the way we've looked at it has been really very inward. Philosophically, we look at what are the risks of getting disease into my farm. What can I do to protect my farm against the introduction of disease? And it's a really kind of a one-on-one type approach. When you start working in a system like I did for a long period of time, we start looking at it a little bit more differently and looking at what can we do to protect a system of production or a group of farm or a specific region. And then you start thinking about a country, because once a disease is introduced into a specific area, it complicates a lot what you have to do to protect that entire region for it. Where if you're looking at protecting a region, there's a few entrants that that you have to look at. I always take some type. Two example I take is a middle age castle versus or more in time, if you like science fiction, is the zombie apocalypse, where you say, okay, if I try to protect my house, I got about every type of entry that could be done. It's very costly, it's very difficult, and you usually fail. Where the approach of having a fortified town or fortified village, then you don't have to worry about your neighbor. You have to worry about the point of entry of that town for the introduction of disease. It really concentrate about the weakness that are there. And when you see usually the failing of those villages was because of a hidden passageway that people were able to enter, etc. For us, when we look at biosecurity in the region, it's the same thing. There's two things that need to be looked. It's an area that people start talking more now that they used to is biocontainment, mean that if you have disease, what can you do to avoid moving it to other region or moving it to favorize the dissipation of that disease. You want to try to contain it at the place where it is. And after that, it's really looking at what are the port of entry that can bring a disease in a specific region. And that's often is overlooked. And it's very critical because that's where problems start to arise. And those have been a little bit more complicated if we look now by, specifically if you look at the United States, as we have moved to a multi-site production, we have also moved to a multi-state production, meaning that we are moving pigs from different regions. And when disease happen, if you are a region that is a net importer of pigs, then you see a lot of those virus coming in, and that can be very problematic. If you go back in the past, until 1995, we were basically dealing with one strain of SIV. It was H1N1, and then that has exploded now to be multiple strain. A lot of it has been associated with reassortment, which happen when population are infected with multiple virus at the same time. As we start doing more whole genome sequencing in PERS, we figure out that there's a lot more reassortment that we're thinking happening. That with pigs that are infected with multiple strain of PERS at the same time, the area usually where those will happen is usually in grow finish. And if you have multiple group of pigs in the same region, that those risks happen. And that's an area that is kind of an unintended consequence of multi-site production. But when you look about other entry of viruses, then you start to say, okay, if my region is basically self-contained, and I've got my sow farm nursery finisher, or I'm a net exporter of pigs, then there's very few entrants that come in that region, and those need to be looked at very, very carefully to minimize the risk of introduction of disease within the region. That mean that it's not just you as a producer or just you and your veterinarian. You basically have to look at it mostly. You've got to be very aware of what those risks are. I understand your region related. Do I have a packing plan in that setup, which mean that it will create movement of pig in the region. Although the packing plan is a dead end, you bring the animal to be slaughtered. That area, especially the where multiple farm get in contact, could be a point of introduction, for example, of PED infection, where if the loading duck get infected with PED from another region, then the truck from this region that come in contact with the unloading pigs can get infected. And if that truck is not properly sanitized, can infect pig in the region. And then that's how the infection start. A buying station where pigs could come from different region that you're not aware of can bring a disease that is not in that region, and if you allow that to amplify, can be spread by aerospread or also by truck. So understanding those as potential risk and understand what type of barrier you can put in place to protect the dissemination of disease is very important. We have a lot of the other thing, genetic animal. We have experience with their high health usually, but sometime things happen, and movement of virus may happen, of meaningful virus into a region can be associated with that. So if you bring genetic animal from other region that are coming in your region, getting those animals into quarantine is extremely important. Get them tested is very important to ensure that you don't have any type of introduction of disease. And if that happens, try to take care of them quickly is important.
Yeah, as I listen to your thoughts there, Luc, I'm really interested, and it emphasizes to me more of a two-way consideration rather than a one-way consideration, where instead of just worrying about what's getting into my barn, you have to be worrying about what might be leaving your barn, or when you're bringing in genetics from another area, what's coming in, but then what's also going back out again. And so that raises a point. Yesterday, I had the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Corinne Talbot, and she was talking about geofencing and the benefit that computerizing some of these things so they can actually keep track of movement, and they can visualize what the movement has been so they can show it to their staff and say, okay, this is why scheduling is really important and why you follow scheduling, etc. Do you see a move within the veterinary community in terms of biosecurity becoming more uh, driven by this kind of computer capability? And part of the reason I'm asking that question is that when I was at World Pork Expo last month, one of the things that I noticed was a huge change from even 5 years ago. Was some of the largest booths at World Pork Expo this year were digital companies that have developed software to monitor things, whether it's oftentimes it's monitoring within the barn, the environment, the feed, the water, etc. But some are going beyond that. So is that something that you see might be becoming more involved in swineherd health and biosecurity?
Most definitely, when you look at the usage of technology and intelligence, we'll not use the AI word because it's kind of a no right now. They are extremely important to understand how dissemination can potentially happen and how those movement uh, of disease may happen, who's got in control in contact, and how that can move. The main thing for us with all those type of information, though, is that it's you can develop a very strong approach around your farm, but you've got to also understand broader of what is happening around yourself to be sure that even with the system of production you start understanding your system in your region very well. Then who are the other points of potential contact that can be represent a risk for me? That's particularly important in Canada when you talk about PED, and looking, okay, what are the actual point of introduction? Can I put in place system to detect those introduction very early outside of my system? That group, governmental and producer group, agreed on, okay, those represent the risk, and do a thorough analysis to say, okay, we've got those buying station there, we've got those packing plant here, those are the movement of truck that go outside and inside. What can we put in place to minimize those risks, and how can we be able to follow through and ensure that all of them are covered? Because often when those issues happen, we say, if we'd have known then what we know now.
Yeah.
So at
Yes.
this point is really looking at, do we have truly covered everything? We have done all the stuff right for our stuff, for our farm, for our movement. What are the other aspects around us that can be potential at risk, and what type of monitoring we can put at place? So we've been very strong advocate of packing plant testing in a region that is, because usually that's where going to be the one of the first place, except for PD, that you will see introduction or a risk of introduction, that you can start then, okay, if my docking station that's were usually always negative and suddenly they're positive, then it means that I'm picking up some virus somewhere. So then you've got to go and say, do I need to go deeper into monitoring to find out what happened there? And that's really that more approach to see, okay, can I find where it is, and then can I contain it before it starts spreading and infecting a lot more of my population? Because often when you look at certain of those disease, the clinical picture, especially on the growing animal, is not that spectacular. So you can miss it, and you can miss it until it's too late. And then the pressure, then the plume of virus, the pressure of infection start to be very high and problematic. So that's really, when you think about it, on when we talk about biocontainment, is being able to recognize early those infections to happen and try to see what can be done to contain it at all level, basically.
Right. Well, so if I'm understanding correctly, Luc, what you're really saying here then is that we need to be looking at this almost at multiple levels. We look at it as our listeners to the podcast, they may be looking at biosecurity from the standpoint of their farm or their system, but they also have to be looking at it from the standpoint of their region, and that both. What if I understand your message correctly is you can't just look at one, you have to look at both, because if you only look at your own farm, you're ignoring a major component of biosecurity that at some point is going to come and bite you on the ankle pretty badly.
Yeah, and it making your job extremely hard at the farm level. If you don't control it, then you've got to get everything perfect, which is hard to do. And it's understanding. It's a little bit of everything. It's even when you look at transportation, the route you use is a critical one. We've had experience where we've put PD negative piglet on trailer, and they showed up positive at the farm by PCR. So why did that happen? And then we went and looked at the route, and basically that those trailer were taking a route that was going close to packing plant, and it was wet days, and we think that it's just through driving through the splashing has basically brought it in a IV contamination. That's the only way. And as we switch the route to move away from those higher concentration of pigs, those incidents basically stop to happen. So there's element of understanding and really being very aware of the risk associated with those interstate movement relate to bringing disease into a region, especially when you say, I've got a very high health area and I want to keep that high health. You got to really dot your I and cross your T relate to any of those risks, and say what is the worst case scenario, and if it can happen, it will if you don't put measure in places.
Yeah, I really like that. I like that example, Luc, because really that was a good example of you could be looking at your farm and just be absolutely meticulous in terms of your biosecurity. But if you didn't pay attention to what was happening to those pigs during transport and what they were being exposed to, everything you did on the farm was going to be wasted. And I actually, another example I can give, a genetics company from the U.S. was opening a nucleus facility in Canada, and I remember them spending a huge amount of time determining what the route of transit of the pigs from the U.S. would be to the new nucleus to avoid the introduction of disease to the new nucleus herd. And that was many years ago, and yet that took them a long time, because they were trying to figure out what were the risks, and then what route would they take to avoid that. So it's interesting you're still talking about that.
Oh yeah, it's yeah, and because when you cross border, if it's a centralized area and you have movement of market pigs or wean pigs going back and forth, then you have trucks sitting next to each other for a period of time, and disease transmission may happen that way. We had an experience in the past where we're pretty sure relate to clinical evidence that the infection of a new strain of PRRS in a farm was associated with a movement of truck that drive. I mean, was not that far from our farm, was about a couple of miles away, but the strain was 100% similar, and I was the only one in the region. So those things of as we start being able to do more sequence and looking and understand more the epidemiology of it, we start to see those event happening. That yeah, those risks are real, and you really have to put them in consideration when you're looking at establishing your biosecurity at a macro level.
Yeah. And as I listen to you and your perspective on all this, Luc, I'm reflecting back on your comment about that fateful move to UC Davis and the training that you received there in the veterinary school on population medicine and so on. So that's interesting how that's still playing such a big part of your career. So as we kind of wrap up, I'd like to ask you. I'm going to ask you for kind of some take-home messages, but before we do that, I'm interested, is it possible for you to share with our listeners just what are some of the most fundamentally important keys to being successful or working towards success in what you're talking about, and regional biosecurity? What are some of the, if you were talking to somebody and you could only, kind of like an elevator talk type of thing, okay, here's the one or two or three things that I see are just uniformly the most important no matter where I go?
It's communication, create consensus is basically getting everybody at the table, getting everybody understand that that's to their best interest to work together to that need, and working as a team to understand what are the weakness in a specific system in a specific area, uh, and working together to bring solution that gonna be a good one for everyone. So it's really a work of cooperation. I think that's why I say it's a need to be more outward. Is if you're looking at, okay, I got to do everything to protect my farm, which is a good thing. And don't take me wrong, this is the right thing to do. But at the same time, when you look at the overall region of what you're doing, it has to be done in an effort of cooperation and team working to bring the best solution that will allow that region to stay free of disease.
Great, great. Okay, so as we turn then to kind of take-home messages, Luc, one of the take-home messages that I've received, and you tell me if it's the right one or correct me if I'm wrong, so I don't mislead our audience, but that that looking in our own operation is really important, and it's a very important beginning point for biosecurity as it relates to our own individual operation. But we cannot look at that just in that sort of singular level of context. We have to look more broadly, because what's going on around our farm is obviously having an impact on the potential biosecurity risk of our individual operation, no matter how well we operate that. So we have to take a more multi-level look at biosecurity.
Yes, we have to, is basically as it's as I say, looking it outward is you've got to work with your neighbors, you got to work with the other system, you have to, as veterinarian, work as a group and exchange about what are the relative risk of the region, how we operate, and how we monitor for those risks, and how we react quickly, not having only a mindset of biosecurity, but a mindset of biocontainment. And
Right.
and
Yep.
and
Yep.
uh, and
Yep.
understand those, because often people will say, okay, if I have a disease, I got to get it out of that farm as quick as possible. It's not necessarily the best option sometimes, because as you put those pigs in truck and start moving them everywhere, you have more risk. So sometimes leaving it there, let it die so the animal don't are infectious anymore before you move them out, is sometimes the best solution. So those points need to be discussed and talk, and having everybody involved and using expert to understand that. But at the same time, developing those plans in advance is key, and then putting plant of, if that happened, that's how we will operate and function as a group. Good communication group, understanding your region, what's coming in, what's coming out, what are the black box that you don't know, try to figure them out better, is really a key to really developing, I think, a strong biosecurity in a regional or area that will minimize the risk of disease introduction.
Yeah. So the word awareness comes to mind when as I listen to you. That you need to, you're proposing that people need to increase their level of awareness as it relates to biosecurity threats and to biocontainment. And I like your emphasis on moving from a concept of biosecurity to one of biocontainment. That has a more dynamic sense to it than biosecurity. So, any other final points before we start to wrap up, Luc?
No, I think that's you resume it pretty well. That's basically it, I think.
It's time for our famous three.
Okay, very good. Well, it's our tradition on Swineit and Swineit Canada as well to ask our guests three questions to wrap up the podcast. And the first question I ask you is there a book that you considered to be a favorite of yours, or that you would recommend other people in the industry read, that you have found to be particularly helpful in the broad area of pigs and swine production or swine health?
Uh, I mean, I'll sound redundant on that because most veterinarians say it, but disease of swine remain the Bible of swine health and production. So it's always a book that I continue to refer to. I bought every new edition as they come in, and I think that that's the one that you need to have on your bedside as as a swine veterinarian.
Very good. Yeah. Not surprising, but it's amazing. People take it for granted, so they don't mention it, Luc. So I'm glad you've mentioned it, because people, oh, well, of course, yes, of course that. But then the second question then is similar question, a favorite book. But this is a book that you've read for any purpose. It could have been read for leisure. It could have been read for professional development, but a book that particularly affected you, and you would recommend to our listeners.
I mean, one I will tell you two. One is the Seven Habits of Highly Effective People from Covey. I think it's an old book, but I think it remain the Seven Habits remain a true. If you apply them and you use them, I think it's always a good tool, and so always a good tool to reread it and remind yourself of how to stay. First thing first, stay in quadrant of important non-urgent. I mean, especially as a tool to mentor young veterinarian or young professional in the industry. I think going through that aspect of understanding the key to be effective and efficient is a very important thing. And I think that book is don't age. I think it's still very reference. Another one that it's more, its reality is not what it seems. It's a kind of quantum physics book that I really enjoy reading to a science aspect of something that I sometimes struggle to understand. My son is doing his PhD in nuclear physics, so I've I've seen him working on quantum aspect a little bit, and that is a book that for somebody that's working more on the biological side of science to go back into the true physics aspect of it was enjoyable for me. So it's a good book for people to want to kind of understand or re-immerse themselves into pure science.
Right on. Excellent. Excellent. And then our final question, Luc, as you look throughout the industry, what would you say are some of the characteristics of people who have been particularly successful in whether it's swine medicine or just swine production in general? What are some of the characteristics that have helped them to achieve a high level of the success they've achieved?
I think that you've got to be a good communicator. You got to be able to rally people. At the same point, I think you need to be pragmatic in our aspects. Sometimes, as veterinarian, we've got to be careful of not getting too dogmatic and pushing an approach, because that's what's supposed to do. What we've been teaching is do situation change? Is that because it come from a book? Is it truly true? Can you question it? Can you approach it and see even the stuff that you have done for a while that have worked? Those change through time, and you cannot be stuck into it. And you've got to question yourself, question your approach, and be sure that you don't do something because you believe in it. Production medicine is not a faith-based approach. We've got to have good science to back it up, and science need to evolve through time. So I think that great communication, question yourself about what you're doing, and don't take yourself too seriously also.
Right. Yes. Yeah, that's a good lesson, I think, for us all. Luc, thank you so very much for giving your time to us today. I found the conversation really fascinating. You've brought up some very interesting point, helping us to evolve in our thinking about containment as well as biosecurity. And I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope that our listeners to the podcast have as well. So with that, Luc, thank you very, very much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. You too, John.